Okay. All right, gang. All right. So here we are. Remember that you were originally scheduled for this Thursday to hand in your papers on the second of the three portions of the course here on the impeachment stuff. But because of the strike that's going to be on Thursday, we've canceled that class, and so I've put off until the following Tuesday for you to hand in your papers, which is going to give you that entire extra time, that whole weekend and stuff, for just polishing, of course, the paper, which you'll have well in hand before that time. But what I want to do today is I want to dig in on the topics that you've been thinking about doing, so we can help hone in on some of the topics, help precise them to make them more interesting for you and a better research project, and so that I can get some good idea of what you're after, so I may be able to figure out some additional sources that you might have, some additional readings and stuff like that might help you on that particular topic. Now, and then they'll be due the following Tuesday, a week from today. So you have a whole week to do these papers that you've settled on here. Now, as you know, that the headlines or lead stories on the television and on the internet now are of course continuing to deal with the impeachment. The constant discussions of whether the Democrats should impeach him now or whether or not they should, just hang him over with major public hearings until the election. Are the public hearings going to be adequately legally justified by their legislative purpose, or is it going to strengthen the hand of Trump and the various witnesses that they're trying to subpoena if there's no impeachment procedure underway? So those are still dominating all the headlines, and they're directly in the wheelhouse of what we've been talking about here. And now you know that Trump has deployed a full carrier group, a whole battle group of naval vessels into the Persian Gulf to stand by next to Iran for potential direct military action against Iran. And is now, Bolton has been leaking to the various media that he's putting together a potential plan of airlifting 120,000 U.S. military personnel to stand by to potentially support an attack on Iran without any particular specification of what it is exactly they've done wrong here, in light of the fact that virtually all the other members of the treaty with Iran, except the United States, are maintaining that they are in substantial compliance with the treaty that they've established on nuclear weapons development. But the Trump administration, let's just say Trump, and Bolton and Pompeo are all engaged in one of their typical kind of self-delusions that they think might be used as a justification for taking some military action against Iran. Now, as you know, Trump tends to use these threats of military force and nuclear war and World War III and Armageddon as simply a negotiating technique, and so that he may be trying to, in a sense, as he said, renegotiate the treaty with Iran, and so he's just threatening total world Holocaust to help get him a little leverage in the negotiation. But that's at the front pages. And as you probably know, China, he's now raised by 25% the tariffs on all goods coming in from China, or most of them. He's threatening, I think, another $300 billion worth of goods that he's talking about putting additional tariffs on. He's just completely out of control on this. And the newscasters are now starting to talk about the fact that, there's a new round this quarter, at the end of this quarter, a new round of sale of U.S. bonds, which China is the one usually buying, and therefore giving money to the United States government. And if China were to simply decide that not going to buy any U.S. bonds this round, it could send the entire United States economy into a complete collapse. So the brilliant negotiator in the Oval Office now is just treading right along the edge of complete catastrophe, where he kind of thinks that that's a good place to be because it's fun helping him negotiate. And in addition to Iran and China, Pompeo is now in Russia today as we speak, negotiating with Russia, getting absolutely nothing for the negotiations, and he is not even talking about the fact that Russia is specifically accused by the American intelligence community as a whole of having engaged in a massive campaign to thoroughly infiltrate and manipulate the American elections. And so it's not on the agenda this morning in the discussions with Russia. And to not leave out one more country, Venezuela, that they've now got the Venezuelan embassy surrounded by Guaido supporters, the insurgent would-be president of Venezuela. Trump is tweeting out constant assertions that it's time for Maduro to be ousted and thrown out, and wants the military to rise up against him. And yet he's extremely concerned about Russia interfering in the U.S. political system. And so all of that's going on in Venezuela right now. As we come to the point in our course here, where we've covered in the first couple of weeks, we covered the issue of global climate change to begin to lay in the kind of basics of global climate change, so that you got a handle on kind of the particulars of global climate change, the scope of the threat, the imminence of the threat that's entailed in global climate change. And we've now focused on some of the particulars that are up front, right in our face, over the impeachment issue. And we've raised the question here about the potential connection between the impeachable offenses of Trump in colluding with Russia and its potential links to the biggest oil sale deal in history that he and Putin may possibly be involved together in. And so we're coming to the end of the sort of the second third of the course right now. And we're getting set to have you write about the issues of the impeachment itself. And this is looking toward the final third of the course, where we're going to be tying the activities of Trump that we've looked at, the whole discussion of the potential impeachment, the various candidates for articles of impeachment against him, his potential relationship to global climate change, and the whole history of the development of oil as the source of power for the United States military industrial complex. And so what I want to do today is I want to chat with you about the range of topics that you're thinking about right now, directing your attention to the issue of the impeachment. And whatever relationship you want to have the impeachment have to potentially global climate change. You haven't gotten quite to the issue of the central issue of the indigenous involved in this. You know that the indigenous people were targeted in North Dakota for the major pipelines to go right through their territory, both the Dakota Access Pipeline and the Keystone XL pipeline, and other pipelines like the Trans Mountain Pipeline is also going through indigenous territory in Canada and in the Northwest United States. We're going to get to that issue starting on, I think, the 24th when we get back, because we're not going to have class on the 17th. So I think that that next class is going to be on the 21st. Starting on May 21st. Okay, so we're going to start digging into that. We're going to be dealing with a number of issues we've touched on in the past about the fact that the Bush senior administration, when they, at the end of the Cold War, proposed forming a new coalition, the new North Atlantic, or the new Northern Industrial Alliance, as they referred to it, and potentially inviting Russia to participate in that now that Russia has spun off all of its ethnic provinces. And the relationship that has to Donald Trump going crazy, trying to keep people of color out of the country, whether they're Islamist people or whether they're Mexican or South American people, and his whole denigration of all of these other shithole countries that he refers to that are clearly racially identified by him. We're going to be dealing with that and dealing with Steve Bannon's kind of overarching strategic analysis that he imparted to Trump when he was there as his principal advisor and was a member of the National Security Council, in which Steve Bannon has asserted that he believes that the fundamental threat to the Western capitalist world is the indigenous people of the world, because they're un-Christian and that they are not supportive of the capitalist exploitation of their resources for some reason. And that we're going to be moving on into that to help give you a kind of a major overview of what the strategic analysis is, if you can actually ever determine that Trump has one. But to the extent to which he has this close working relationship with Steve Bannon, you can get an idea of what Bannon is talking about and what kind of engines their operation right now. So what I want to do today is I want to get an idea of what your thoughts are at the present time about what subtopic of the issue of impeachment that you want to direct your paper to, so that I can get a better idea of what it is you're thinking about. If some of you haven't yet kind of focused on what it is you want to write about, I'd like to have you do that so that I can get some idea of what potential additional resources there might be for you to take a look at. There's tons and tons of stuff flying around about this now, and so I want to be helpful to you on that. So why don't we start? Raise your hands, those of you who have already gotten some idea about what it is that you want to write about, so that we can chat about this thing. And then, okay, we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Good. Now, the rest of you keep thinking now, right here today, because I want you to try to see if you can come up with some good focus for your paper. So let's start over here. What is it you're thinking of doing?
I'm thinking of writing about the history of impeachment and how it's affected how people are handling the potential Trump impeachment.
Okay, how people are handling it. Okay, what's your thesis?
I don't have a fully fleshed out idea yet, but so far I've just been thinking especially about how the Clinton administration and the Clinton impeachment really damaged the concept of what impeachment means and the power of that. So
the inquiry that was undertaken against Bill Clinton, because of its lack of convincing bona fides, and it seemed like a major hunt for him, that it's somehow undermined the credibility of the impeachment process itself, so that the average citizen might assume that the motive behind any kind of an impeachment inquest is just as invalid as that of Bill Clinton. Is that right? Okay, but so let's keep so what? I'm just trying to so assuming that you can show the analogy, and that the people might not have adequate confidence in the impeachment process. Therefore, what are the implications of that?
Well, I see the implications being the Republican Party seeing potential impeachment of Trump as just a like move of the Democratic Party to kind of, grasp at anything, which is kind of what was seen on the other side during the Clinton impeachment.
Yeah, and therefore, when the Republican Senate refuses to convict him, they're going to be able to suggest that a significant plurality of the American people didn't support him being convicted, and therefore Trump is going to get away with it, and he's going to be the nominee for the Republican Party, and there's a chance that he could win re-election. And so therefore your argument would be that in light of the history of the Clinton impeachment try, that it might not be the wisest thing for the Democrats to actually impeach him, but to continue on and just go into the election and beat him there.
And let him make an example of himself.
All right. Okay. So that topic has been covered. Okay. So any of you, if you're thinking of writing about the exact same topic, then I would suggest rethink it, because we don't want a whole bunch of people writing all about the same thing this time. We want to get a view of, actually what it'll be is kind of a view of your generation of what the different subtopics are that you think are really important on this. Okay, so what are you thinking about?
So I'm thinking about two topics as of right now that I'm still kind of like getting at. The first one is kind of focusing on the Mueller report and like the other three, like the rest of the 7 things that were mentioned in it.
Yeah.
And just kind of going into depth about that. I'm not sure where I would head with that either. Then another thing that I'm interested in is kind of like what happens once he does get impeached. And I don't know if I could write a paper on that. So like what happens to kind of like the government that's like right now, like who would go into president and like how would that affect, how would the general public react and stuff like that. But I'm not sure how I can get that.
Okay, so let's take a look at both of them. The first one is that I think in light of the fact that there are now 800 former U.S. prosecutors who have signed the public letter saying that they believe that in Volume 2 of Mueller's report addressing the issue of obstruction, that whereas Mueller has outlined 10 specific potentially obstructive acts, but that the letter from the 800 former U.S. prosecutors keeps focusing on 3 of them. That you're saying is that there's 7 others that you think are worthy of analysis.
That could be worthy.
Okay.
I mean, they were clearly worthy enough for them to be in the report, so I feel like they should at least be more looked into.
Okay. I would suggest if you go that route of picking topic A that you're thinking about, is that you should try to focus on one of them, at least of the 7, that you think is probably your favorite candidate, and sort of marshal the best evidence against it, or for it, to say that, look, this looks like one that at least should be added to the 4. If in fact the Congress, the House Judiciary Committee is going to be being guided by collective public sentiment, and that this letter signed by 800 former U.S. prosecutors is pointing at 3 of them, you've got an idea that if you look through the other 7 of these, there ought to be at least one other major candidate. And it would be a good idea if you picked one of those and then built the argument around why you think that one is arguably sustainable. Okay? But now the second topic that you are thinking about is that assuming he does get impeached, and I'm assuming you're saying if in fact, well, what happens if he gets impeached? That's what you said. Obviously, you know that he's going to go to the Senate for trial. And that what you could do is take a look at exactly what the procedures are that are established there, elucidate those, because we haven't gone into a lot of detail about what those are. It'd be helpful for you to be able to find that out. And you can do so by looking at the Clinton trial in the Senate. So you can see what the protocols were that were followed, such as the United States Supreme Court Chief Justice sits as the judge, passing on procedural matters. The prosecution team comes from the House, etc. There are a lot of logistical details and procedural details. And then what you want to do is explore what you think the implications are going to be if he is found not guilty by the Senate. What is it he's going to do with that? And if he is found guilty and Pence becomes president, what do you think the probabilities are that he's going to follow the precedent of Gerald Ford and pardon Trump for any of the federal criminal offenses that he might have committed over and above whatever it is he's convicted of? And you might also, I would suggest, if you go down B route, you want to take a look at what happens if, in fact, there comes a point in time somewhere after his impeachment and prior to his conviction, Trump decides to just resign and walk away like Nixon did, and then leave the office open to Pence, and then Pence can potentially pardon him for things that both were articles of impeachment and things that were not. Okay? And there's one dangling thing you're going to have to deal with in that one is, what about the state charges that the New York State Attorney General is investigating Trump as well, and the D.C. District of Columbia, which is arguably federal. There's a whole, stay away from that because it's a little complex, but you take a look at the one with New York State, because Pence doesn't have the authority to pardon Trump for state offenses, just for federal offenses. Okay? All right.
I kind of have like a rough thesis. I don't know if you want me to read it to you or
Yeah.
Okay, so I wrote, contrary to its conclusion, the Mueller report provided substantial evidence that a tacit agreement did in fact exist between the Trump campaign and Russia, implicating both parties as guilty in regards to criminal conspiracy. If recognized, criminal conspiracy is a much larger, complicated, and serious issue than the obstruction of justice charge currently being investigated by congressional Democrats, and would be the lever that would undoubtedly, in a bipartisan effort, remove Donald Trump from office.
Okay, let me see if I heard that right. That this is looking at volume 1, the collusion question, and that I think what you want to do is you want to be very clear, drill down on what it is exactly that Mueller said about that. That he was saying that he was concerned that he might not be able to prove beyond a reasonable doubt the essential elements of the collusion, okay? And that one of the principal ones is the agreement.
Well, conspiracy, nothing.
Conspiracy, exactly right. That he said, look, there's no such thing as collusion, all there is conspiracy. In order to prove conspiracy, you have to prove, among other things, a formal agreement. And I might not be able to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt, but there's also a very rich vein in there. He said, it's important to point out that further investigations by the FBI might well be able to change that. So the fact of the matter is that contrary to what Barr said, and of course contrary to what Trump keeps saying, and what the Senate Republicans keep saying, is they never did say there's no evidence of collusion or conspiracy. He just said that he wasn't adequately confident that he'd be able to prove beyond a reasonable doubt the essential element of an agreement here. But what you want to do in that, you want to take a look at what the investigations are that have been still delegated to the FBI, because there are a handful of these investigations going on. Okay, one of which, of course, is the Rosneft issue. That's all you see is a one-liner saying, oh, well, that issue has been assigned over to the FBI. So what you might want to do there, going down that important road, is to find out what active investigations there are going on by the FBI, and that would include other U.S. attorneys' offices, which is the Southern District of New York. What are those investigations? And there's another one going on, I think, in the Eastern District of Virginia. And there's one going on in Washington, D.C. So you want to take a look at what those, because that caveat that he's got in there of course, there's ongoing investigations which may turn up something that would in fact support evidence of an agreement. Okay, so you want to see what the relationship is between those other investigations and whether they go to the issue of the existence of an agreement or not. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, is that on the first page where he says that?
Pardon?
Did I just because I didn't see that. Is that
See what?
where he says that there's still ongoing?
Oh, yes. He says that in volume 1. He says that it's important to point out that there are FBI investigations going on that may develop evidence that will cause us to change this finding, which begs the question, then why did he quit now? If those investigations are still ongoing, there's something happened that caused him to believe that the time was right where he had to come forward with this. But there's still these active investigations going on, so you might want to mine those investigations and see what process might lead to folding those findings back into volume 1 and changing the conclusion.
Yeah, but also I'm a little confused how George Papadopoulos or whatever, he was actively going to London and meeting with that professor,
Yes.
or whatever.
Yeah, the professor.
Just by extent, he's part of the Trump campaign, and they're.
Well, he was actually on the president's National Security Advisory Committee. And then they said he was an advisor, a foreign policy advisor to him on his campaign, whatever that means. But you want to just take a look at that. So you're going to raise, I hear you're getting ready to raise, well, wait a second, what about this? Isn't this pretty obvious? Yeah. And I think you want to be able to make an argument that there are at least 2 or 3 of these acts of collusion, acts of cooperation, acts of coordination, acts of solicitation, that you might think you want to make an argument that the Congress should pursue those. They shouldn't get distracted over into just looking at obstruction. They should actually look into the substance of these particular issues because you believe that these are ripe. And what you might want to do, given the brevity of the paper, you can go beyond 10 pages. Did I say 10 pages? Whatever. You can. Don't worry about the page length if you really get burrowing into a thing like this. But you might want to pick one to say, look at. I think this 1 or 2 acts of collusion or cooperation are adequate to support an agreement. Okay? And then be sure to point out that other thing. Moreover, there's these things still going on. All right? And that'd be a good paper. It'd be a good paper. Okay.
I was thinking of doing what is the argument for impeaching Trump and what are the arguments against it. I haven't really worked on it yet.
The big question, the one going on inside the Democratic Party right now. Okay. Now we have to go a little deeper on that because that's pretty well trodden territory. And I don't want you just sort of codifying a whole bunch of stuff that's perfectly obvious floating around here. The principal argument for impeaching him is going to be articulated by Lawrence Tribe. And so you'll probably want to get a look at a copy of his book called To End a Presidency, okay? Because he sets forth a whole series of affirmative things that you'd want to do if you're going to impeach someone, but a whole bunch of caveats as to why you ought to be very careful about doing this. But in light of you have to get his official statements that have been made now, where he says he thinks the time has come when you need to impeach him. Okay, so he has said that now. So that's, in light of all of his qualifications, all of the caveats and everything that he had in his book, he's actually come to the point of saying that. So he's going to be the most solid, responsible source to cite of saying that the impeachment needs to take place and see what his arguments are. And track down all the different times he's been interviewed since saying that and how many kind of flourishes he's put on that. Because he's going to be the rock on that side. And he's perfectly cognizant of the arguments that are being made by Nancy Pelosi primarily, and by Chuck Schumer, and you will hear being said by Joe Biden of saying that, look, this is going to alienate his base and infuriate them and get them all mobilized and all het up as though they weren't already. And you don't want to do that. And what they're avoiding saying, and I'd like to have you take a look at this thing. What they're not saying, the Democrats aren't saying it, and even Tribe is not saying it. The threats of violence. That you want to find those quotes by Trump where he said that if in fact the Democrats impeach me, there's going to be rioting in the streets. I can guarantee it. And he's also said things like, if they try to impeach me, remember, I have the military on my side, I have the police on my side, and I have the bikers on my side. And you don't want to offend them because it could get very, very bad for you. There's a series of things that he said like that that is kind of an unstated argument on the part of the people who are arguing against impeaching, because there's a threat of actual violence on the part of his supporters, because they would view this as an act of treason. And he uses that phrase. So find the number of occasions on which he's used the word treason for people, impeaching him. All right, and then on the other side of it, there's you don't want to just stick with the kind of, I guess you could just say commonly understood arguments that Nancy Pelosi and the rest are making is, the fact is that if we impeach him, and it's clear that the Senate is going to refuse to convict him, and if they refuse to convict him, he's going to assert that he's been exonerated, the whole thing was a hoax, and he's going to have that to strengthen his probabilities of winning the election. Okay? Now, and so they argue against doing that, but the countervailing argument is, and only a few people make it, Van Jones makes it a number of times, when he says, like, wait a second, when the Republicans went after Clinton and impeached him and put him on trial and he was acquitted, then you would think that would have redounded to the benefit of the Republicans, and it did. Okay, so it would redound to the benefit of the Democrats now, even if they did do that, because the Republicans took over the entire House of Representatives, after they ran the impeachment at him. So this argument that Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer are saying, oh, how awful it would backfire on us, and they ignore the actual history of what happened to the Republican Party, even though they unsuccessfully brought him to trial in the Senate. Okay, so you want to take a look at those lesser arguments, the ones that are below the surface from the obvious arguments that they're making. Okay, all right, that's a good one. How are your thinking going?
I didn't really reach anything. I kind of just wanted to
You're listening.
listen.
Okay, all right. How you doing? You're listening. All right. Okay, keep listening because we're going to come back to you here. Okay, so. What are you thinking?
So I'm thinking they're going to do the third one as well, whether or not it's impeachment or not. I think that the structure of my paper is going to go something along the lines of he needs to be impeached because of the risks that he's posing to the planet in terms of climate change. Mm-hmm. And then at the end, I want to do research into the Rosneft deal and see if I can make some sort of claim that he has personal gain from it. Mm-hmm. And then I think that's going to be it. But I really also think an interesting route would be looking into the security state apparatus and how the power that they have had has grown exponentially since 9/11 through these different laws, the FISA courts, and their use of the grand jury. Mm-hmm. I think that could be another really interesting paper, right? Learn a lot. But I think just because of the times we're in, I think it'd be best to make the argument that he needs to be impeached because of his continued investment in a death sentence for our civilization.
That's the big one. That's the big one. Okay. How are you thinking? Okay, I'll come back to you. Okay. All right. Okay. We got to do some good thinking here, you guys, because that's what we're here for, is to try to get you to hear what other folks are thinking, so you can figure out what you want to do.
So I was potentially thinking of doing it on, hypothetically, like if, or maybe not so hypothetically, if he was impeached and Pence became president, what his, I guess, entire presidency would look like, what people say is like an ultra-conservative agenda.
That's cool.
So like examining that based on Pence's like political background and his stance on policies.
All right. No, that's a good one. That's a good one, because a lot of people haven't thought that far about it. And if Trump were actually convicted, if he's impeached and then convicted, because he isn't removed unless he's convicted in the Senate, okay? And so that even though there's a very low probability that the Republican-controlled Senate would actually convict him, it's worth looking over the horizon to see what would happen with Pence coming in. Would Pence continue all of the outrageous active programs that Trump is involved in, of threatening Iran with attack, threatening to have a war with North Korea, the things that he's doing, the tariffs, et cetera. Would he continue all of those awful programs? And are there any additional ones that he might do because of his kind of extreme, consistent conservatism? And that would be a good place to point out that Trump historically had not always been viewed as a consistent conservative. And he's had positions all over the place, including supporting, abortion and other things. You might point this out, and that the real threat from the right is Pence, and not Trump, because Trump is so erratic and inconsistent in his lack of ideology and his lack of any kind of systemic thinking. That's a good one. And you might, but as a caveat to that too, you want to point out that there is this dangling issue of Pence's relationship with Eric Prince. I want you to take a look at that. That Eric Prince, the founder and CEO of Blackwater International, that you'll see has changed its name a couple times. It changed its name to a thing like OPI or something, and that's now changed its name to the Academy, but you'll track it down. But anyway, he had these set of meetings, and you'll find a bunch about these now. They're writing about it more now, that he had these meetings in the Seychelles Islands with a representative of Putin to discuss the opening of a potential back channel directly between Putin and Trump that would be not overseen by the State Department or monitored by the CIA or anything else, but to set up a completely secret back channel between the two of them. Now, it's important to raise this because I want you to find the history of the relationship between Pence and his family with Eric Prince's family. Okay, Pence's family with Prince's family, to show that there's lots of information around that. Nothing that Eric Prince does is not known by Pence. And Pence's assertion that he was completely out of the loop on this, he didn't know anything about it, it's directly analogous to George Bush Sr. in Iran-Contra, saying, I didn't know anything about this, even though their meetings were going on in my office between my national security advisor, Donald Gregg, and the people shipping the arms to the Contras. Okay, so go into a little depth like that to take a look at that aspect of it. Okay, all right.
My argument's pretty much like the argument for impeachment on a few different fronts. First off, by refuting the prevailing Democratic kind of moderate that it'll come back to bite them in the election. And I'm going to use kind of election demographics and kind of polls and stuff from the 2016 election to kind of, because if you look at the polls, I mean, it's exactly as you say, like, it's not going to fire up Trump's base. Trump's base is already fired up. And, you know, these people that they're going to fear rally to them are the people who vote anyways. And these are the people who are going to come out to vote at the end of the day. And a lot of people forget that Trump lost the general election. And that this huge, you know, fervent, well, they're probably ravenous, but they're not as big and ravenous as I think the modern Democratic Party makes them out to be. And then the further, I guess, pro-impeachment one on constitutional principle in the Holtzman book. She has a neat little section on kind of how the framers intended the impeachment clauses to be used. So 1 on constitutional principle, 2 on the Article 2, Section 3 clause for faithful administration of laws duly enacted. And then 3, I think there's enough, having gone through the Mueller report, I think there's enough, and definitely Section 2 on obstruction of justice, there's enough there to, you know, like if you read it, he said, yes, all 3, you know, factoids have been met. And, you know, if the prosecutors have said, you know, that there's enough evidence to support that he's committed crimes.
Okay.
And that should be more than enough to impeach. He has committed crimes. The evidence is there.
Okay, now, but I would recommend that you address the issue of the Republicans, the probabilities that the Republicans, no matter how convincing the evidence is that's in the House to support his impeachment, the challenge to whether or not they would convict in the Senate. And if they refuse to convict in the Senate, what are the steps that the Democratic Party should take to potentially target there's 22 Republican senators that are going to be running for re-election in 2020, and there's only 11 Democratic senators. So you check out who those 22 senators are and find out if there's any of those that are going to be in adequate trouble, that it's conceivable that you might get them to vote for impeachment. Because the embarrassment of all that evidence being put in against Trump and having them just woodenly say, no, I will not convict him no matter what he does, is going to be a pretty powerful argument to be made against those people. And take a look at who the candidate is or candidates are to run against that Republican senator. And you might just check out who the Democratic National Committee is targeting of those 22. You know, there's going to be probably 10 or 12 of them. Now, and one final piece on this, just to make it thorough, that is that in order for the Democrats to realize the great bounty that they're planning to get in 2020, say they win the House, say they win the White House and get rid of Trump, and they win the Senate over, okay? Any effort they make to try to pass a Green New Deal is going to be confronted by the filibuster. Okay, and that the Republicans, if they hold enough of those votes, of the 22 of them that are running again, if they stave off to only losing 3 or 4 of those, even if they lose control of the Senate, which they now have a 52 to 48 advantage over. If there are 3 of those, bless you, if there's 3 of those seats that change and the Democrats get control technically of the Senate, the Republicans still have access to the filibuster. And they can stop any legislation from getting passed. Okay? And so the bottom line is they're going to have to win 14 of those 22 seats. And you want to take a look at that and see whether you think there's any realistic chance they can do that. Okay, so this is that bounty that the Democrats are all planning to get to have happen. Okay, to just evaluate that for us. Okay, now these are high quality papers that I'm talking about you're doing here, but you're displaying the grasp of the kind of basics. So I'm just trying to push you over into a little of the extra territory that you might not have been thinking about before to really make it an excellent work. Okay? Terrific.
For my paper, I wanted to talk about what historical precedent that an impeachment would set for the future and how it would affect future presidencies. And I have a negative impact for impeachment, which is it diverts time away from issues that are happening in this nation and that matters. Yeah, so that's sort of the basis of my paper now.
Okay. So let's take a hard look at that, okay? There is this trope around, oh, if you spend all this time impeaching him, and having these hearings that go to the impeachment, you're not going to have time to do a lot of these other really important things. They aren't going to get to do those anyhow, as long as the Republicans are there. And it's important to face that. And whatever good it's going to do to pass them in the House of Representatives, the Democrats control where they'd be spending the most time figuring out whether to impeach him in the House. That you've got to be careful of being lured into a hollow argument. Is that, if the Democrats forego spending time passing legislation on important issues, which are going to get blocked in the Senate anyhow, then it's a disservice to the American people, because there are so many other important issues that really need to get addressed. And if they're not addressing those, then they're not fulfilling their obligation to their constituencies. But if in fact that the Senate isn't going to pass them anyhow, you have to address the issue of what is the actual value that's been gained, even from their perspective in the Democratic Party. It's not that there is none. They could, for example, say, see, if we had a Democratic Senate here in 2020, we could have gotten these things passed because we could get them passed in the House. Okay, so that's the counter argument. All right. So, but you still have to deal with the filibuster issue, because in the Senate, not only do they have the weapon of being able to retain control of the Senate unless the Democrats win 3 of those seats away in 2020, they have the filibuster, which even as a minority party, they can stop the legislation. And so that has to be part of your computation here, because this idea of the impeachment process, even though as a matter of principle they might do that, and they maybe should do that, that the fact that it's sacrificing passing this other legislation that the country really needs, you really need to take a hard look at that. You don't want to just say that kind of in a facile way and then be ignoring the fact that they can't get it past the Senate anyhow. Okay? All right, let's do that.
So I have kind of like a broad, guiding question. I'm not exactly sure what it's going to take me, but I want to look at what it would take for an impeachment to result in like a lasting progressive change in governance and in discourse. I've thought about looking specifically at how everything played out with Nixon and how that did result so much in a lasting progressive change, and how Reagan was still able to come relatively soon after that with a pretty reactionary conservative agenda and be extremely popular. So I'm thinking about looking at which routes for impeachment would be the most conducive to that, and then looking at the presidential election as well in 2020, how those two could connect, and potentially what the best connection would be to achieve that outcome.
That's cool. Okay, so let's think about that. Now, you do need to remember that when Nixon technically he didn't get impeached. Remember, they voted out articles of impeachment out of the House Judiciary Committee, and they were getting ready to go to the floor of the full House, and it was clear that they were going to pass, and so he was going to get impeached, and they dreaded that more then, because there'd only been the one previous impeachment all the way back to Johnson, back after the Civil War. And so that there was a big dread of getting impeached at all. And so when the Republican leaders came to Nixon and said, you're going to get impeached, they passed the articles out of the Judiciary Committee, and there's enough votes in the House to get you impeached. And so in order to avoid that, you better quit. Okay? But the fact of the matter was there was in fact, it was the high watermark of the kind of liberal, progressive counterattack against the national security state with the impaneling of the Church Committee and all the Pike Committee in the House. They both were digging into the CIA and its assassination plans and all that stuff that they were doing. There was a huge surge there. And in fact, Jimmy Carter was in fact probably the most liberal president elected, even in counting Franklin Roosevelt. And so your thesis is on difficult ground right there because he did come in as a very progressive person. He fired 834 people from the CIA. He cut off military aid to Somoza. He cut off military aid to the Shah of Iran. He was doing all kinds of things that were considered were considered a part of the progressive agenda. Okay, and then you're going to have to grapple with the October surprise, because the October surprise attack against him, which entailed not only the attack against him by Casey, at least, going and meeting with the Hezbollah and getting them to agree to hold the hostages to make him look weak, right? But you're also going to have to deal with, or you should deal with, because you now know about it, and I'll have to help you to figure out where you can find any evidence of this, but the importation of the funds by the CIA through Shackley, who was working in Bush's campaign as the vice president, to attack the other senators, to attack Frank Church and to attack Dick Clark in Iowa, to attack Birch Bayh in Indiana, and to attack Senator McGovern in South Dakota, and attack Alan Cranston in California. That millions of dollars were brought in to attack them by the Central Intelligence Agency. And so that you have to factor in to this computation that you've got going here about how likely is it that there can be a progressive resurgence in the wake of a successful impeachment of Trump in light of the national security state. Okay? And the full, I guess, dream scenario would be that in the 2020 election, that Bernie Sanders actually defeats Joe Biden for the nomination. That's the full scenario. He's the more likely, but this early on, that Joe Biden has got 41% in the polls, and Bernie's at 15%, and Kamala Harris is the only other one that even has double figures. And, Elizabeth Warren and the others dropped down to 8%, 7%, 6%. And so that you have to carry through your thought, carry your thought through of the potential for a progressive outcome for the impeachment. And the big question here, and this, you're going to bump right into it, is what happens when Bernie gets in? Given the power that has been asserted by the national security state infrastructure to oust Trump. Okay? And that's that whole thing with that Epoch Times Spygate thing. Because there's no doubt about it. That a subtext of our class here has been that the power that's being asserted by the national security state infrastructure, CIA, FBI, NSA, all of them, to get rid of Trump, even as much as we might all want him to be gotten rid of, that kind of muscling up of the national security state to all go after a president who is out of line with their agenda. Okay? And so that you're going to have to deal with the agenda of the national security state and how that would assert itself in the face of a potential rise of a progressive outcome of the impeachment, directly analogous to the progressive response in the Jimmy Carter administration to the Nixon impeachment. Okay? But it's a great topic. It's a lot of stuff in there to work with. Great.
So I want to discuss the foreign emolument and how that could lead to his impeachment, and
Uh-huh.
also how being involved with his businesses still can affect, like, it can create like a conflict of interest in the
Yep.
sense that, like, whoever decision he makes, it could be in the interest of his companies, or it could be in the interest of America, but we won't really know.
Yeah, there's let me see if I made a note about this. There's a book around that is called, let's see if I made a note about it, the betrayal, Trump's Betrayal of America, I think is the name of it. And the fellow's, what's the fellow's name? I'll get it to you. Pop a note to me or something. There's a whole book on this, and it's got this massive set of footnotes in it of all the articles that talk about all the different business deals that Trump was involved in and how they've been going on for 30 years and who he's been dealing with and all those things. It's a great piece, and I just can't think of what the guy's name is now. But just get a hold of me, and I'll get that to you. Okay, I've got a copy of it because you might not. I don't want you to have to run around and buy a whole copy of it, and I can get a copy of it to you. Okay, if you just pop over to the office or something. Okay, all right.
I don't have a thesis at the moment, but I wanted to look into the FISA courts, because I previously didn't know anything about it, and pretty much look into what it exactly is, the process in which it operates, and the precedents that it sets via the investigation into Carter Page, and potentially the uses against political dissidents that may occur after that.
Far out. That's far out. Okay. The FISA court really sucks. You can start out with that under assumption. That Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, I mean, it's shades of the Palmer raids and all that kind of stuff. And what it is, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act was passed by the right-wing elements in the Congress to authorize warrants that do not meet the Fourth Amendment standard. The Fourth Amendment standard of you having to have probable cause to believe that a crime has been committed before you can invade the privacy of a person, to investigate their papers or their home and the FISA warrant, the FISA court is a group of hardcore right-wing Republican judges that are in the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. And the FISA court, you'll find some great articles on this. Of the FISA warrants, I think the last time I checked on it, there was something like 4,162 FISA warrants requested, and like 4 had been denied. And what the standard is that all it is needed to get the court, the FISA court, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act court, to grant a warrant to place under surveillance, which includes not just following them around and taking pictures of them and searching through their garbage, but wiretapping their telephones, doing breaking into their homes and placing electronic listening devices in their toaster, and all this stuff that they do. In order to get the court to give you one of those, or give the FBI, it's usually the 5 Squad, the Division 5 of the FBI, that engages in domestic investigations, political investigations. And all they need to do is have an articulable suspicion that information relating to the national security of the United States might possibly be discussed. Okay? And then all the constitutional barriers fall in the face of that. And so that is a very dangerous court. And that they started out, and they still maintain the pretense that one of the parties that they're undertaking the surveillance to get the information from has to be a foreign person. Okay? So that they pretend to be sensitive about issuing these things against an American citizen. And that they're only allowed to look at conversations that involve a foreign person. Okay? And I'm not saying that it wasn't it would not have been legitimate to have one against Page, Carter Page. But the problem is, in doing a constitutional analysis, the test isn't really whether there was a legitimate grounds, if you were to articulate one, to do a FISA warrant against him. The question is, what is the standard that they had to meet? And if the standard they had to meet could have had them doing surveillance on anybody here in the room, that's unconstitutional. That's constitutionally overbroad, and it's too overbroad and vague what the standards are for that. And that this tracks back to the whole thing of 9/11, even though the FISA courts predated that. But that whole thing, when everybody goes just kind of catatonic, Oh, okay. Do you want to tell me before you leave? Yeah, do it.
So I was going to break down the main forms of articles of impeachment for Andrew Johnson, Richard Nixon, and Bill Clinton.
Yeah.
Break them down to comparison because of the historical analysis of it. I'm doing the first one, by the way. And then after that, do a non-impeachment. And I found this article in Wikipedia that breaks down for the sources who's been impeached by a member of the House of Representatives and who hasn't, and who has been acquitted and whatnot. So I was looking at that list, see comparisons, and if you guys you should actually really look at that list. It's on Wikipedia, but it informs you a lot about why people have been impeached and reasons for it, and a lot of them are similar to what Trump has done for obstruction of justice and articles that relate to that. So really do look that up. It'll help your paper a lot. So just using that as a source, and then compare the history of impeachment and non-impeachment with people that have been impeached and why with their articles, but mainly focusing around the ideas of Johnson, Clinton, and Nixon, and focusing how because of the cultural shift, because of identity politics sort of basis, they have these articles may be similar, but because of A, B, and C, they haven't been those. Okay. So it's kind of like modern culture in comparison with historical analysis, and then bringing forth Clinton, Nixon, and Johnson, and comparing them to Trump.
Okay, you're free to go. Okay. Okay. All right.
I'm doing it on Trump's grip on the Justice Department, how the two pardons that he did with Joe Arpaio in 2017, when he pardoned this county sheriff coming into court for the two, he was a racial profiler, and Trump pardoned him. And I'm also doing his pardon on the former chief, for Dick Cheney, Scooter Lee, he pardoned him as well. And then I'm doing how he fired Comey, and how he always tweets out I can do whatever I want with the Justice Department. That's my department to overrun. So I'm doing how that his abuse of power is showing with who he's pardoning, and who he's firing within the Justice Department. He pardoned Scooter Libby, who has leaked information of CIA operates, and he was under oath and he said he did not. He's rewarding someone who lied under oath, and he's showing that that's okay for an American to do that, and that's not only okay, but it's okay enough for you to get saved if you do that, and you should sell.
Straight. Okay, that's great. That's a whole different. That's straight abuse of power. That's far out. That's great. No, that's terrific. It's up out of the weeds. It's a whole different attack right at him. Of abuse of power, and it's smarter than going down in the weeds like a lot of them are on the particular obstruction of justice things. His flagrant abuse of power in the power that's been given to him, it's clear that he's not trustworthy to be vested with this kind of power, and that he's going to be abusing it. And not only for emoluments, for his own personal financial benefit, though that's crass and craven, but just flagrant authoritarian doing that. So that's cool. Now you want to take a look though here, because there's this sleeping suggestion that he might be prepared to actually pardon some of these people. That not just the offering or dangling of the pardon, which could be an obstruction of justice thing, but the actual granting of the pardons, okay? And so the question that you're really looking at here in some sense, a really important question is, in looking at a potential abuse of power charge against the president as a grounds for impeachment, what is the degree of discretion that the Congress of the United States really intends to delegate to a president? To how outrageous can it be? And you take a look at George Bush Sr. when he pardoned the first 6 people in Iran-Contra that were indicted by the special prosecutor after all those years and millions of dollars of investigation. He just flagrantly pardoned them, and it was clear that in fact he was pardoning them to avoid them testifying against himself. And it was Barr that recommended it. So that you circle back in on this thing with Barr in the impeachments, and because there's an awful lot of discretion that has been delegated to the president to allow him to pardon whoever he wants to. And he even said, I can pardon myself, which is totally nuts, because it says right in the Constitution that he has the power of pardon except in cases of impeachment. Okay? Yeah, but go get him on the abuse of power. Okay? That's a good one. Okay, let's circle back now. Have you guys been thinking at all about what it is you might want to write about?
Yeah, so I'm thinking of doing the first prompt. I kind of want to look at the reasons for impeachment, and he didn't get impeached, but in Nixon's case, and then what are the reasons in the possible impeachment of Donald Trump, and then look at the differences and the similarities and why they're significant, and then what does it say about the justice system.
That's a big one. I guess that's a big prompt. That was okay. All right. I would suggest, even as well, I would say this, that it is absolutely clear that the bogus impeachment attempt against Bill Clinton raises fundamental questions about the good faith of a party out of power in going after a president with whom they disagree on policy issues. It's a transparent act of that. But there's a thing that you don't know about yet, and there's no reason why you really should, is that the real motive behind impeaching Bill Clinton was because Henry Hyde, who was the United States Senator from Illinois, I guess, hardcore right-wing guy, was terrified about being indicted and impeached for his involvement in the Iran-Contra scandal. He was actually involved in overseeing and okaying the shipments of weapons to the Contras in the face of the Boland Amendment that had been passed by Congress prohibiting the administration from being involved in giving any aid, direct or indirect, to the Contras. And he got caught. He and Bill McCollum from the 5th District of Florida got caught actually in meetings with Rob Owen. Rob Owen was the former staff person for later Vice President Dan Quayle, when he was the senator from Indiana that took Birch Bayy's place, actually, when they canned Birch Bayh in 1980 with this October surprise thing. And Dan Quayle's staff guy on Latin American affairs, Rob Owen, became the liaison for Oliver North in meeting with the Contras and providing weapons to them. And they got caught in a meeting. Bill McCollum and Henry Hyde got caught in a meeting with eyewitnesses of going over the arms shipments that they were sending to them. And Hyde was terrified that he was going to get impeached and potentially prosecuted for that, right? And he was angry at the fact that the Democratic Party didn't stop the investigation of all of that, because the Democratic Party never initiated the investigation of all of that until they were forced to do so by public revelations that this massive shipment of military equipment was going down to the Contras, being coordinated through the Pentagon. Okay, so you have to take a look at that if you're going to look at the Clinton impeachment, because the lack of bona fides of the grounds on which they asserted it. And you remember, they went searching all around to try to figure out what to impeach him on. They started first with the Whitewater scandal of him allegedly being given special privileges in buying into this property, a Whitewater property, when he was governor in Arkansas, and they didn't get anything on that. And then they went looking to see whether or not the travel office of the White House was being misused to reward people. Then they went looking to see whether or not they were insisting upon getting campaign contributions in exchange for people being able to sleep in the Lincoln room. And there was this Star Chamber-like quality of the special prosecutors going after one thing after another, until they finally hit upon this thing with Lewinsky and him committing perjury. Okay? The reason that I'm raising this is you don't want to be citing the Clinton impeachment when everybody in town knows that it wasn't bona fide. Okay? So that they'd have to be able to con the American people into believing that it was bona fide to begin with. Okay? Which they obviously weren't able to do. They weren't able to convince that he had 60% plus popularity rating, when they were trying to impeach him. And nobody believed that it was bona fide except the hardcore Republicans. And they didn't even believe it was bona fide. They just did it because they wanted to do it. All right? So I'm just suggesting that if you're going to be doing an analysis, you might preferably look at the Nixon impeachment stuff. Okay? Pardon? Yeah. And not spend an awful lot of time on the Clinton thing, because it's got all these depths and strange things going on about it that it's not a strong model to use. So I would suggest looking at especially because of the obstruction stuff. You got a straight up case of, wait a second, the stuff that Nixon allegedly got impeached for was the obstruction of justice. And it all came from that June 23rd meeting of instructing Bob Haldeman to go get John Ehrlichman and go over and see, Vernon Walters and Dick Helms over at the CIA, and have him contact Pat Gray at the FBI and tell him to get out of the investigation of the bank in Mexico City. That you're going to get digging down into this, and you're going to come up with a thing with, well, wait a second. What can you say about this? If that's why Nixon really got impeached and thrown out of office, why isn't it obvious that Trump should get thrown out of office for any one of those 10 obstructive acts? But you're going to have to answer that. That's going to be the hard part, because if on the face of it, it doesn't make any sense, you have to offer some theory or thesis as to why why is it he's not being impeached hands down, with 800 former prosecutors saying he should be impeached and citing these obstruction things and then citing back to Nixon. What's the answer to that? Okay, so I would think that's the real exploration that you got to get into on this thing. You set it up in the first couple of pages saying here are the obvious parallels of this. It's right on the face of it. They're obviously parallel. And why is it that Nixon ended up getting out of office over it and Trump isn't? Okay? And you have to figure out what the answer to that is. Okay? All right. How are you coming? You thinking of anything yet?
The two that really caught my attention was the impeachment aspect. You guys talked about that one.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I think his abuse of power one. I think that was a little bit better when I listened
Yeah.
to that one. And I think that's something that like if I went more into it, I would be able to find something. But I think that's like where I want to start.
Okay, so what are some of the kind of things that you're thinking of that he did that are abuses of power?
Well, I think if I were to start I guess I would do it like in a timeline sort of thing. I would start with the election, and although he didn't hold like a position of power, this like I can talk about his like rise to influence like with his members, and from there it like solidifies like his ability to like just continuously like, lie in office and just like shout his message without any like sort of contention within his own party.
One of them is, for example, if in fact he was dangling offers to Russia to lift the sanctions against them, if they would give him support, that's abuse of power even as a candidate, And if he's suspecting that he probably isn't going to win, but he's abusing his power as the Republican Party nominee to try to lever getting to build the Trump Tower. That's an abuse of power as the candidate, as the nominee. So that's a good spot to start. You got the right idea of starting kind of a timeline of what are the acts of abuse of the power that he had at the time, whether a candidate or the nominee or the president-elect or as the president. There's 4 different phases in which he had a certain kind of power, and that there are various types of acts he may have engaged in that would constitute abuse. And what you can do is you put those together as a pattern of abuse and make the argument that he should be impeached for an abuse of power. And that what you need to find out, and this is one that you both need to look at on the abuse of power thing, is where does it say that? When it says he can be impeached for commission of high crimes and misdemeanors, where do you get the abuse of power from? Okay, so everybody goes dashing to their local. Do you guys carry a copy of the Constitution around with you yet? You don't yet. Okay, you probably should. Yeah, you can get them. You can get them for free. There's a whole bunch of places that give them to you for free, but you guys ought to try to get one so when you're having these long discussions on Saturday night, hanging out at your house with all your friends and stuff, and the debate on the Constitution comes up, you guys can just whip this thing out and show it to them. Okay, so so find that where a straight up abuse of power where's the criteria for that? What type of precedents are there for that? Okay? All right. So that gets us through the first, that gets us through the list of them. Everybody's, I don't think you haven't told me yet.
I plan on analyzing what are impeachable offenses and connecting that to how Mueller just kind of kicks these ideas of this question of obstruction onto Congress. And how that kind of raises the question of dividing to constitutional duty to prosecute president in such case.
Mm-hmm, yeah. So that you'll want to take a look at Larry Lawrence Tribe's book, because one of the arguments that he makes, in a sense, is that there's no clear constitutional obligation to impeach. Even though he's saying something that sounds very much like it now. He's now saying if they were in the face of all of this evidence, if the House of Representatives were to not impeach him, they'd be failing in their constitutional duty. And yet in the book, he writes that, it's not clear that there's an absolute obligation to impeach a president just because he does A, B, C, or D. That it's a political decision. And the political decision really opens onto this question of whether or not they believe he has lost his political power because of something he's done. Something he's done that has been exposed deprives him of adequate power to govern. He lacks legitimacy. The people don't believe him. They don't trust him. He's lost his ability to govern. And remember, that's exactly what Richard Nixon said. Richard Nixon said, I am resigning because I've lost my capacity to govern. Okay? Which is an interesting concept. And so that you might want to explore that. Because the actual political decision that needs to get made is usually by the members of his own party. Because usually the one party doesn't have a 2/3 majority in the Senate to convict him. Okay? And so they absolutely have to have some support from the president's political party. And so that the real political question that they ask themselves as the same party of the president is, has he been exposed for having committed certain acts that so undermine his credibility and legitimacy as the president that even we who are in his political party, who are inclined to support him, realize we have to ditch him and go to the other person in our party who's the vice president, to get them in power. Okay? So that's one that you might want to take a look at because you'll see in Larry Tribe's book, How to End a Presidency, that's what he's ultimately asserting, is that you really have to be able to get at a president to show that he's done something that has so undermined his ability to carry authority, to speak with some authority on behalf of the office of the presidency, that it behooves his own political party to join in convicting him. Okay? And you might want to point out why you think either they have reached that point with him or they haven't. And try to explore, why the Republican Party people are holding on so vigorously to him. Okay? Is that helpful? Okay. All right. Okay.
So I was looking over the prompts and I really like the second one. Would want to focus on that. It's like what historical president would happen and like what would the political discourse follow. And I would want to look into just like similarities of what were like voting patterns for the next presidential election after someone was impeached or almost impeached, like in the like Nixon area. And I would also want to just highlight that if he were to be like impeached or convicted on like climate change or environmental, it would set the precedent that the public wants a president who cares and recognizes climate change, and see hopefully if that changes like voter patterns or anything like that, like voting patterns.
It would be really great if, because that second thing that you're talking about is so huge, and to sort of go through the whole part, the first part, which she's going to be working on anyhow, that you might take out a piece of that second prompt and take a look at this thing, is that try to explore the viability of impeaching him because of his conduct with regard to global climate change. Is there a way to craft an argument, and in light of how well you did on your first paper, I've got a lot of confidence in you on this, that if you focus on how one would go about setting forth the evidence against him with regard to global climate change and what a potential catastrophe it is and how strong the evidence is for what's going on here and how flagrantly he's disregarding all of that, and look to the kind of obligations a president has to protect the commonwealth of the people and to protect protect the national security of the country, and for him to be engaged in the active measures that he is, even setting aside the potential secret criminal activities that he's engaged in, the overt acts that he's engaged in, ordering the opening up of all the national parks for drilling oil and the Indian reservations and pretending when he, on the 24th of January, after he was inaugurated, coming forward and saying, well, there's sort of a national emergency, a domestic energy crisis. And so therefore we have to kind of override the Environmental Protection Acts, in order to going forward to the Dakota Access Pipeline and the KXL pipeline, that can you construct a systematic indictment of him for his imposing climate change on our country, and therefore show that that's a failure of office of him in such a profound way that he needs to be removed from office. Okay, that would be great. Okay, so that's cool, you guys. So look at don't hesitate. You got a week on these papers. All right. Are there any other questions? Yes.
So I was thinking that how before Watergate came out, how Nixon wanted to fire Cox.
Yeah, he did fire Cox.
Yeah, but he got someone else to fire him. But then the Attorney General resigned.
That's right. Findings resigned.
Can I tie that to how Trump and
McGahn, of him trying to order McGahn to do it. Oh yeah, no, that's all real rich territory. Yeah, that whole thing with McGahn, ordering McGahn to go get him fired, firing this. It's important to point out though that and it's something that people don't really focus much on, but the fact of the matter is that Mueller is not a special counsel. Even though they refer to him all the time as a special counsel, they use that term. That used to be a particular statute that was passed by Congress to explicitly set up an office under the statute that could get triggered by certain things to have a person who is acting independent of the Justice Department. They use resources of the Justice Department, but there's no supervisory authority over them inside the Justice Department. That's the whole point of it. And even though he wrote the letter Mueller wrote the letter to Barr chastising him for stepping in and making a decision saying that there was no evidence of collusion and that there was inadequate evidence to support an obstruction charge. He said, that's defying the entire purpose of appointing, he said, a special counsel. Well, all he was an employee of the Justice Department, because there was no special prosecutor statute. There was a special prosecutor statute back then. And so that, and the media has been quite successful in sort of blinking that distinction here, constantly referring to him as a special counsel, constantly insisting if he did anything to fire him before he got done with his job, that, that would be a grounds for impeaching him and drawing back. But you need to recognize the distinction there, at least you drop a footnote. But yeah, the parallels between Nixon firing Archie Cox and then having his attorney general resign and the assistant attorney general resign, and he had to go all the way down to what's his name, Bork. Yeah, had to go. I mean, you got to go down pretty low to get to Bork, and he got to Bork, and Bork fired him and was rewarded by being nominated to be a Supreme Court justice for that foul act that he engaged in. So all of that's very important, and you got all kinds of stuff with McGahn similar to that. Okay? So anything else before we all run back and start working on the papers? Okay. Great. Okay, now I know you're disappointed not to be here next Thursday, but I guess just strike. Okay?